Let's review Chapter 2, Rhythm, Notation, and Rests. You'll remember on page 17 of your textbook the pictures of each of the note types. So first we have our whole note. The whole note is equivalent to 2 half notes. Half note, each half note is equivalent to 2 quarter notes, making a total of 4. Each quarter note can then split to 2 eighth notes. Now the eighth notes can be a little bit tricky. Some people have not been clear that this with the flag, and that's what we call that little part right there, by the way, is the same as these eighth notes here with what we call the beam. So this is still 2 eighth notes right here. This is still 2 eighth notes right here. This is just when there's 2 of them together, they can be written with a beam. Often when 4 of them are together, they can be written with one big long beam. What we do is we look at this part, which is called the note head, and we know that this is still 1, 2, 3, 4 eighth notes. An eighth note then can be split into 16th notes. You'll notice the difference is that 16th notes each have either 2 flags or 2 beams. So if we're talking about how many beats each of these notes get, a whole note is what we would consider to be the longest note value in music, basically, okay? And remember, we're always going to think about the names of the notes as how it relates to this whole. So let's not think about a half note as getting a half of a beat or a quarter note getting a quarter of a beat, because that can be a common mistake that's made. We want to memorize the name of the note sort of separate from how many beats that note gets. So we want to think about the name of the notes as how it relates to maybe a whole pie or cake, if you like cake better. I do. So a whole note, we can think about it being a whole piece of pie or cake, a whole cake. Half, we split it in half. Quarter, we split it in quarters or fourths. Eighth, we would then split it in eighths. And 16th, I don't know if I can do that very well. Okay, there we go. It would have 16 pieces. So that's kind of where the name gets it from. Now, in general, the most common form of music, which we'll talk about common time signatures, and if you don't know what that means, we talk about that in the next chapter, in chapter 3. But in most music that is on the radio, most popular music, you're going to think about that whole note up here as getting 4 beats. Now don't get mad later when I tell you we count it differently, but for the most part we count it as 4. So if the whole note counts as 4 and we split that 4 in half, how many beats is each of those half notes going to get? 2. If we then split up those half notes and we split the whole 4 beats into 4 parts, each of these quarter notes would then get 1. From then, if we do the same thing with the eighth notes, we split the quarter notes in half. We have 8 parts of that whole. Each of these eighth notes is going to be a half. I just wrote the wrong thing. Because we're splitting 1 in half. So a half and a half makes 1. So each of those is a half. Got ahead of myself. And if we split each of those half of a beat in half, how do you half a half? You either take a half times a half, and you can think that it's a fourth, or if you cook, you know that if you need half of that half cup measuring cup, you need a quarter cup or a fourth of a cup. So each of the 16th notes, and when I'm talking about the 16th notes, I'm talking about each of these note heads. Each of these note heads right here is now worth a fourth. So let me go ahead and just label each of these values. Whole note, we're going to assume for the most music that we're talking about is going to be 4. Half note, we're going to have 2 and 2. Quarter note, we would have 1, 1, 1, 1. Okay, so each of these, I'll just write a 1 over there. Each of those is worth a 1. Each of these eighth notes is worth a half. And now when I say each of these eighth notes, each note head is what we're talking about. So either the one with the flag, that's a half, that's a half. Now, each of those are a half, so that's a half and a half. Or if we wrote them together, what would a half and a half be? 1. So this whole pair of 8 notes would be 1 beat. These 2 pairs that are stuck together, think about how many note heads there are. 1, 2, 3, 4. So a half times 4, or a half and a half, which makes 1, plus another half and a half, which makes another 1. This whole thing right here would be 2 beats if that were written together. 16th note, I already wrote it down here. Each of those note heads is worth a fourth of a beat. So when you have the 2 flags or the 2 beams, each note head that's attached to that beam is worth a fourth. So this pair of 16ths, that would be a fourth and a fourth. What's a fourth plus a fourth? A half. So both of those together are worth the half. Most commonly, how you're going to see 16ths is in this group of 4, okay? Because that's 4 sounds on the beat, and we'll practice how we count them in a minute. So there's 4 of those on one beat, so each of those would be worth a fourth. A fourth times 4 is 1, so this whole thing right there is 1, etc. Okay, now the way that we would count these is just the way that it sounds. If you're playing it on the piano, you would hold down the note for 4 counts. I'm just going to clap it for you. So the whole note, we would count it like ta, or some people learn the number system and they would just count 1, 2, 3, 4. They say that in their head, or just 1. From there, we would have a half note, which would be like a ta, ta. Quarter notes would be ta, 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 ta. Eighth notes, there are 2 sounds on every beat. And that beat is that steady pulse in music that we feel. Kind of like our heartbeat, or that sometimes you hear that bass drum of a car that's going by. You hear that boom, boom. That's the beat that we feel. So an eighth note has 2 sounds on each beat. So if this is my steady beat, it would be T, 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 T. That's how the eighth note would sound. 16th notes have 4 sounds for every quarter note, which would be the beat. So it would be 4 sounds on the beat. Some people learn tika, 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 tika. Some people learn one and two and some people learn one ta te ta, two ta te ta. That's a tongue twister for me. I grew up learning one and two and three and four and I'm not bobbing because I have, you know, a problem with too much dancing. I'm bobbing because that's the steady beat. So what I'm trying to show you guys is the steady beat. Steady beat does not change. It does not speed up or slow down. But the rhythm, obviously, some notes were longer than the steady beat. Some notes were shorter than the steady beat. So that's kind of the difference between the rhythm and the steady beat. Now these are the note values. Of course, we also learned about the rest values in chapter 2. So let me go ahead and stick up each rest value that corresponds. The name does not change, but the note, obviously there's sound, but the rest, we have no sound. We're silent. Do we still count it? Yes, or else we would not be able to come back into our music. And some of you that have been in band have probably had to rest for pages and pages where you're just counting, counting, counting. So rests are really important. They also give singers and instrumentalists a chance to take a breath and breathe. So the whole note, I always say, looks kind of like a hole in the ground. Also 4 beats of silence. Half note kind of looks like a little guy's hat. Usually I draw this little guy. So there's his little top hat, okay? Quarter note, squiggly line is what I usually say, or kind of like a lightning bolt. Eighth note, I always say it kind of looks like a funky 7 with a blob on it. That's the official definition. No, I'm just kidding. But you can think about an eighth note that it has one little blob. It has one little, kind of like a backwards flag, okay? Whereas the 16th note has 2. So does that correspond with the flag notes and the beams? Yes. So an eighth note has either 1 flag or 1 beam. 16th note either has 2 flags or 2 beams, but the rest has 2 of the backwards blob flag. So that might help you remember those. And that's really just a memorization thing. Memorize the name. You can go ahead and memorize how many beats those get if you haven't already, but remember in chapter 3 we're going to learn about some different ways to count.